Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem, wa ala ali wa ashabi, wa man istanna bi sunnati ila yawmiddin. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. This session is a continuation from the previous, which dealt with basically the seventh chapter of the book, which covers the fifth stage known as the stage of consolidation. Consolidation stage basically covering the last 300 years of the Abbasid era. Prior to that, we looked at the period which we referred to as the period of flowering. And this was the period in which the many madhabs arose. The fiqh was supported by the state, and that was a time of rapid development, and a lot of beneficial research and development took place. In the 300 years which followed that early 200 years of the Abbasid era, the first part of it we refer to as the era of the great imams, and the second one of the lesser imams, their students, etc., and the great scholars of hadith. They were in that second period, which was still a vibrant period. Following that, the 300 years, we had a period now of consolidation. Basically, all of that flurry of activity which took place in the earlier 200 years was now systematized. It was all written down. Books of fiqh were developing, styles in how those books were written became standardized, and the four leading schools had taken on prominence. Not that the other schools didn't exist at all, but people were beginning to forget them, or just the scholars really were conscious of them. This period, although, as I said, it was a period of consolidation, at the same time, an element of decline had begun. This culminated in 1258, the middle of the 13th century, with the sacking of Baghdad, where the Mongols coming out of Mongolia, led by Genghis Khan and his children, reached the heart of the Muslim empire and state. The last Abbasid caliph was assassinated, was executed, and Baghdad was sacked, was burnt down, libraries burnt, scholars killed, assassinated, murdered. And this was a period, a very painful period for the Ummah. What took place after that? Of course, the Mongols eventually were absorbed into the Muslim state, in that after taking over this area, this empire, or the portion that they gained control of, they needed people to help them administer it. So they had to choose from among the Muslim population people who had skills in administration, because the Muslim empire, in spite of its decline, etc., still was far more advanced than the Mongols. Well, the Mongols, they came from a nomadic desert-style life, and they came in contact and control over this large area, of huge cities with, all kinds of technology, etc., which was available, and they couldn't really govern it. I mean, beyond the force of the might that they had in their armies, etc., they had established military control, but they needed administrative control. So they brought into their administration many Muslim administrators, scholars, etc., of different, from various fields. And eventually, the message of Islam reached that Mongolian leadership. And of the grandchildren of Genghis Khan were those who converted to Islam. And they continued their move all the way into India and became what was known as the Mughal Empire, the Mughal Empire, which ruled India for almost 1,000 years after that, they are the descendants of the Mongols, who were pagans when they came, converted to Islam, and continued their sweep into India, control of India, and rule of India. But back at the center, the consequence of their sacking of Baghdad, the center of learning of the Muslim Empire, and other Muslim cities and centers, was that the whole body of fiqh and their scholars was in a state of disarray. So many books were burned, so many scholars were killed, that the remaining scholars found it necessary, in order to preserve what existed, the existing body of Islamic Sharia that was there, in order to preserve it from people who were coming in and playing with it, the danger of them coming in ignorant, not properly trained, and then abusing the principles, etc., that were there, and changing the religion to suit their own whims and fancies. It led the scholars of that period to, or many of the scholars of that period, to speak against the ijtihad of the madhab, which had existed in that latter 300 years of the Abbasid era. Even that was closed. And so, as a whole, they closed the door to ijtihad. Now, it's not to say that there were no scholars who opposed it, because of course, scholars like Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, who was from the latter part of that era of the 13th century, he was opposed to blind following, spoke out against it and taught against it, and had generations of students that came after him who continued to keep the concept of ijtihad alive. So though the majority of scholars did close the door, there were still scholars who opposed it and tried to keep that door open, and they continued to make rulings. But of course, they became very unpopular, and they came under attack. Maybe they were declared as apostates. There were rulings made against Ibn Taymiyyah, labeling him as apostate. He was jailed. He spent most of his life in jail, and he died in jail, as a matter of fact. So it is not surprising to find that the overall characteristic of this era, and the one to come, which extended for some 700 years right down to the 20th century, was one of a blind following, which we refer to as taqleed. Blind following as distinct from enlightened following, ittiba', because fundamentally scholars have to follow scholars before them. The Prophet ﷺ had to be followed by his Sahaba. The Tabi'een, those students who studied under the Sahaba, had to follow the Sahaba. The Tabi'een or Atba'u Tabi'een who followed them had to follow those who came before them, and so on and so forth. That has been the way. That no scholar today can sit and consider himself independent of all the scholarship that came before. I mean, you hear it. You might hear it. But those who make this kind of a claim are people who have deviated. There's an individual, for example, in South India, well known, popular in the Tamil-speaking area, who has built a name for himself, but is one who doesn't follow the scholars who came before him. In fact, he rejects their rulings and considers himself their equal, though his knowledge is not sufficient to put him anywhere in this category at all. And he came so far as to make a ruling concerning zakah, that people who have paid zakah on their money once do not have to pay it again. He went to that point. In fact, I wrote a treatise against his ruling, looking at his arguments, and I dismantled them, brought evidences from the Qur'an and the Sunnah to support the position held by the Muslim Ummah for the last 1,400 years. But that individual, as I said, is one who then considered himself so free that he had sufficient knowledge to go and make his own ijtihad. So he would dare to actually go back and cancel and negate rulings by the Sahaba. based on his own personal understanding. So that's the danger that comes out of it. So Islam does support the idea of following the earlier scholars, the earlier generations. The Prophet ﷺ had said, the best of generations is my generation, then those who follow them, then those who follow them. So this idea of following the earlier generations is a valid point in Islamic law and has to be maintained in order to preserve the authentic character of the body of Islam. Because it is by following that earlier generation that we're able to link ourselves with the original message. Once you stop following and start doing your own thing, then the original message is easily lost, which is what happened to Christianity, for example. So you have another religion. The religion of the time of Jesus and after him is different completely from the religion of Christianity today. So, therefore, when we look at this period of time, we see a new principle emerging. A principle which was non-existent earlier. The earlier principle was that madhabs were just approaches of the various scholars. Whether they were scholars of great repute and well known, they had large numbers of students studying under them, like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, etc. Or they were scholars of lesser repute, not necessarily of lesser skills, but they were less known, they had less students, etc. Or they were scholars who were in conflict with the earlier Abbasid or Umayyad governments, and they were forced to go into hiding and things like this, so they could only teach in private. So we had a variety of different issues that affected the early madhabs. But the way in which these madhabs were conceived was that they were efforts by scholars to follow the madhab of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That was really the one and only madhab. Their individual madhabs were just efforts to elucidate that original madhab and to follow it as closely as possible. Now, what that meant was that scholars of that era had no problem in studying under other scholars of the era. Imam Ash-Shafi'i is the classical example, who studied for over 20 years under Imam Malik, not considering teaching himself until Imam Malik had died. Then going to Yemen, absorbing knowledge which was there and teaching there, then being dragged to Baghdad and accused of Shiite leanings, having to defend himself, establishing that he was from the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, from the mainstream of Muslims, then taking advantage of his presence in Baghdad and studying under the students of Abu Hanifa. Having done that, writing new rulings, then leaving and going to Egypt, where Imam Al-Layth ibn Sa'd was based, studying under his students, because by the time he got to Egypt, Imam Al-Layth had already died. So he absorbed the fiqh of Imam Layth, changed many of his rulings, wrote a new book, and settled in Egypt. And then his madhab dominated Egypt. So the madhab of Al-Layth was absorbed into that of Imam Ash-Shafi'i. And people didn't have an attitude saying, well, my Imam was Al-Layth, so I'm going to remain Al-Laythi till I die. No, this was unthinkable. People, scholars of that era, traveled widely. And Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the last of the great Imams, he himself was a scholar of hadith, going and gathering hadiths from all over the realm. And then, under him, people studied, the major scholars of hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, and others. They studied under him. And they continued the tradition of freedom with regards to madhab. So though Imam Shafi'i may be labeled a Shafi'i because he did study under scholars from the Shafi'i school, he wasn't. He was from what we would call Ahl al-Hadith. And that became in itself a madhab, though it didn't have clear principles that defined it with regards to the usul, etc., as existed with the other schools, but it represented another school. And nobody had a problem of following fiqh schools or following hadith schools or following tafsir schools or whatever. Scholars were free to do and to choose and to travel and to learn. Whereas in this period of time, what we had emerging now was a new concept, that the madhab became equivalent to Islam itself. The four madhabs now became divinely ordained representatives of Islam, each one equal to the other in theory, each one equal to the other in theory, each one correct in and of itself, and each one had to be followed for a person's Islam to be valid. One who didn't follow a madhab was considered an apostate. One who shifted from madhab to madhab was considered a sinner who would be punished, lashed by the judge who caught them. This was the attitude which had arisen at that period of time. So, and we spoke before about the ruling that Hanafis couldn't marry Shafi'is, and this was the ruling which came out of that era. The four prayer places around the Kaaba came out of that era. The great masjids built in that era, we can see commonly in Jordan, in Syria, in Iraq, in that area which we know as Sham, where both the Shafi'i and Hanafi madhabs were in contention. You find in the great masjids there 2 mihrabs. When we now know a mosque is built, you have 1 mihrab where the imam stands. But in the mosques of that era, they had 2 mihrabs, and you can still see them till today. 1 mihrab for the Hanafi imam, 1 for the Shafi'i imam. Though we said that on one hand, taqleed, this blind following, became firmly entrenched in this period, and we're talking about midway in the 14 centuries of the final dispensation of Islam. From the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ till our time, we're talking about 14 centuries. The first 7 centuries takes us to the sacking of Baghdad. So what we're looking at, this period of stagnation and decline, really decline had already set in, but really stagnation and the completion of the decline, this period we're talking about almost 700 years, bringing us up to the present. We're just sort of emerging from that. A lot of it is still there. The idea that a person doesn't follow a madhab today is still looked at in most places as being unacceptable. If you express that you don't follow any particular madhab, though you do follow the scholars and their rulings, etc., you're automatically labeled a Wahhabi, and Wahhabi means a person who doesn't follow a madhab, an apostate, an heretic, or you may be called Ahl Hadith, because the same movement against blind following developed in India, Pakistan, under this heading of Ahl Hadith, those who gave precedence to the Hadith rulings over the rulings of the schools of Islamic law. And they were looked at as being some kind of a deviant group, though today their rulings can be found in some books, modern books, where they will mention the ruling on a different issue of the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, Hanbalis, and then they'll mention the ruling of the Ahl Hadith. Right? So that period now is characterized by the dominance of the madhab, where the madhab then became the representative of Islam itself. What led to it? We could say on one hand, the period of consolidation before, where all of the madhab details were worked out, and speculative fiqh had basically reached its peak. It had exhausted all of the areas of practical speculation, and they went into impractical and illogical speculation. We talked about some of the examples from that era, things which made us laugh when we look back at it, but it was a sad period. So when you've done all of that and you close the door to ijtihad, there's no room for any more thinking anymore. It's only about learning what was in the past and regurgitating it. The second factor was that in this, from the latter part of the Abbasid era, when it was crumbling and the state was crumbling and the ministers took over, it's the era of the ministers, the wazirs, some of them were Shiites, you find that the care and concern for fiqh was lost. So the concern basically of the government was more in political control, etc. And Islamic laws weren't given the precedence that they were given in the earlier era, the vibrant era of the early Abbasids. So that also contributed to the emergence of the madhab as being the explanation of Islam. Also, what you found is that with the crumbling of the Abbasid state, in that period of confusion after the sacking of Baghdad, many mini-states arose. Once the Abbasid rulership was ended, the Mongols controlled the area that they controlled, but then the other areas that weren't under their control developed as separate states. And what would happen is that each state would take a madhab for itself. So you found, like in Egypt, the main madhab became the Shafi'i madhab. You found in Spain it was the Maliki madhab. In Turkey and India it became the Hanafi madhab. So you find that each state now taking on a particular madhab and choosing governors for the state, judges for the state, all from that particular madhab. So anybody in that area who was trained in any other madhab, basically if he wanted to make a living, if he wanted to work in any kind of administrative post, he had to take on the madhab of the state. And the fourth reason we said for the major stagnation was the closing of the door of ijtihad. That decision made by the scholars of that era in order to preserve the teachings from individuals who were starting to make rulings. There weren't scholars to challenge them, etc. So they had a certain amount of freedom, and there was a danger of them changing the religion through the changing of its rulings. So the door for ijtihad was closed by the majority of scholars of that time. Though there was a minority, we said, who, like example of Ibn Taymiyyah, who kept that spirit alive and continued to promote the idea of ijtihad and oppose the closing of the door. Now, what happened in terms of fiqh and how fiqh evolved during this period? Because in the previous period of consolidation, what we found is that the rulings of the various schools were now compiled into major works, major texts, which absorbed in their contents all of the various rulings of the generations before. Now, what happened in this period was that these huge writings of that earlier period of consolidation, with the decline in the care and concern for fiqh, or students wanting to study fiqh, with that decline taking place, then nobody was willing to go and study these huge texts. So what happened is that the scholars of that era, in order to promote fiqh, at least to some degree, what they did was they began the process of condensing these major works. So they started to reduce them in size, drop the isnads, which were rules, dropping some of the different opinions which were not really considered within the madhab, etc., to bring them down. After they brought them down in size, from like 20 volumes down to like 10 or 5 volumes, then abridgments were made. Even smaller summaries were made from them. Furthermore, some scholars of this era even went to the point of reducing them to poetry. So you could, in 1,000 lines of poetry or whatever, memorize the whole of the madhab. As you memorize the hadiths, You had poetry which developed to memorize the rules of Arabic grammar. You had Imam Alfiyat ibn Malik, who's known as Alfiyat ibn Malik, in which 1,000 lines of poetry contained all of the rules of Arabic grammar. You had Alfiya al-Iraqi, all of the rules concerning hadith science were reduced again to 1,000 lines of poetry, and they did the same with the fiqh books of that era. Because of course when they're put to rhyme, it was easier to memorize them, right? And what happened is that in order to make these texts rhyme and become easily memorizable, then the scholars would use, the poet scholars would use obscure Arabic terms which were not in common use, and they would use obscure constructions, grammatical constructions which are not in common use. So though they managed to put all these things now in 1,000 lines of poetry, the students of that time were now stuck with a set of riddles. These things were saying things they couldn't understand. So then the process of explaining these lines of poetry began. So another development took place where scholars now went back in, would take these lines of poetry and start to explain out. So texts were built out of this. But so what we can see is that nobody's going back to the original, right? They're not going back to the Qur'an and Sunnah anymore. So you saw a process of compilation, reduction, and then now explanation. Away from your basic evidences. So the key now was to try to explain these books of poetry for the later students to be able to understand what they're memorizing. They still kept them, they would memorize them, but now they had the explanation to go along with it. But the explanations were usually without a lot of evidences. They were just really clarifying the meanings of the words, what it refers to. So general implications were given. That's all. Precise understandings were now lost. So people memorized rulings. They didn't understand the sources of these rulings anymore. They just knew the rulings. So you now as a judge, when any ruling came to you or any case came to you, you could draw from this store, this bank of memorized poetry immediately and bring a ruling. Here's the ruling. Now, what is the evidence for that ruling? You may have it, you may not. You weren't concerned with the evidence. It was just enough to be able to make that ruling. What happened in this period also, as fiqh was consolidated and summarized and abridged, etc., usul al-fiqh, which is the principles behind fiqh, that whole field, that science, was developed by one of the great imams. Who was he? Known as the father of usul al-fiqh, Imam al-Shafi'i. And his seminal work was al-Risala. Anyway, the point is that the scholars of this era, when they taught usul al-fiqh, because you had to teach it, and they would teach it according to the usul of their particular madhab, then what they did is when they came to the area of ijtihad, because that's one of the chapters or one of the sections of usul al-fiqh, they talked about ijtihad and its benefits and things that are related to it. And then, in order to apply ijtihad, they set a series of conditions for its application. Now, when you look at the conditions which they set, and many of these are still taught till today, these conditions are so stringent that even the Sahaba couldn't meet them. The earlier generations of scholars who had been making ijtihad from the time of the Sahaba up until that point, they were now excluded from making ijtihad when they had already done it. So basically, though they were teaching usul al-fiqh, they were teaching it just as knowledge for the sake of knowledge for their madhab. It wasn't knowledge to empower the scholars to be able to utilize these principles and come up with new rulings. So what we find then is the books of fiqh of this era, as the era continued, though they may even bring some of the arguments of other schools, basically they're established to reaffirm the rulings of their own school. So there are other rulings were just attacked, criticized, put down, and these rulings of that school promoted. Towards the end of this period, not to say that efforts to bring the fiqh into line with the needs of society, we can find that in the Ottoman era, in the Ottoman Empire, in the 19th century, an effort was made to codify Islamic law, to put it down in a codified, organized way, similar to the codes of law used in Europe, in Italy, in France, in England, in the US, etc. They developed this system of codification. So efforts were made then to codify Islamic law so that it could be more easily accessible for the administration of the Islamic State, which was then known as the Ottoman Empire. It was completed in 1876 and enforced as the law for the whole of the Ottoman Empire. It was called Majallatul Ahkam al-Adila, or the Just Codes. Majallatul Ahkam al-Adila. However, in spite of this great effort, and it is to be commended, the problem which arose was that it was the product of blind following. So the scholars were scholars who promoted taqleed. So when they sat down to make up this code, the Ottoman Empire, its rulership, its administration chose scholars. They only chose scholars of the Hanafi madhab, because that was the official madhab of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ahkam al-Adila, al-Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adila, the just codes were just codes according to the Hanafi madhab. So it was something which ignored all of the rulings of the other schools and only promoted the rulings of the Hanafi school. So this didn't really serve the kind of purpose it should have or could have served in terms of promoting Islamic law, re-promoting Islamic law, at a time when various states, different parts of the Muslim world now, had begun to accept Roman, Greek, British, French law into their systems, because there were so many gaps. Remember, from the 15th century, from 1492, when, of course, that's celebrated as Christopher Columbus discovering America, but it was also the fall of Spain, when Muslims were driven out of Spain, and the ascendancy of European colonization began. They began, after driving Muslims out of Europe, they began now to take different parts of Africa, of Asia, of the south east parts like Indonesia and Philippines, etc. They now started to take over these areas and to establish their rule and to impose their legal systems. So Muslims in some areas where they did retain certain control, they still absorbed into their systems in order to be able to keep up with the developments that were taking place around them. They absorbed different European codes into their legal systems. So what you found then was, throughout the Muslim realm, Islamic law is being reduced more and more to the areas that we now know them. When you go to different parts of the Muslim world, you ask about how Islamic law is implemented, you find that it's basically Islamic family law. Just issues concerning marriage, divorce, and inheritance, this area, this is what we find still implemented in most Muslim countries to a large degree. And it is only in Saudi Arabia where the official Sharia is enforced according to the Hanbali madhab. In Pakistan, the Hanafi madhab is officially the madhab of the country. In Iran, we have the Ja'fari madhab. And in Sudan, we have the Maliki madhab, officially enforced for the implementation of the Sharia in these countries. All the rest of the countries, basically, and these are the big countries. Of course, there are smaller countries like Sharjah and others in the Emirates and others that do have Islamic law on the law books. But the vast majorities of others utilize French, British, German, and other European, Italian law codes to govern their countries. And that's what we are living. That is the legacy that Muslims are living today. And the rise in Islamic consciousness is, this awakening taking place is calling now to the return of the Sharia to its proper place, that these other laws need to be confined or removed or modified in order to meet the standards which are set by Islamic law. Now, during this whole period, as we said, though taqleed was the dominant feature, there were scholars who opposed it. And I mentioned before Ahmed ibn Taymiyyah, who died in the early first quarter of the 14th century, opposed the taqleed. He opposed many of the rulings made by the scholars of his era, promoting the madhab. Though he studied the Hanbali madhab himself and is considered among the scholars of the madhab, the Hanbali madhab, he didn't restrict himself to that madhab. He frequently went beyond it, chose rulings from the other schools of Islamic law. And he actually went so far as to study even the writings, religious writings of other major religions like Christianity and Judaism, and refuted their ideas from the Islamic sources. He was actively involved in jihad against the Mongols, who had occupied the eastern and northern provinces of the former Abbasid state. And they were threatening Egypt and North Africa. He fought against them. He joined in jihad. And his students became the great scholars of that next generation, or next two generations after him. Raising and keeping alive the banner of ijtihad. Among them was Ibn al-Qayyim, as well as Imam al-Zahabi, as well as Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir's tafsir we know today. He has in many of the areas of his tafsir writings from Ibn Taymiyyah's writings. However, the scholars of this era, even Ibn Abil Izz, for example, who did the commentary on Al-Aqidah Tahawiyah, who utilized many of the texts of Ibn Taymiyyah, they would mention them without mentioning where they came from. It's only later scholars looking back, familiarized with the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, realized that they were plagiarizing, taking huge amounts of material from Ibn Taymiyyah and not attributing to him this information, because they would then come under attack. Not because they wanted to claim it for themselves, but because anyone who would proclaim the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah was looked at as some sort of a deviant. From the latter part of this era, some 300 years ago, 200 to 300 years ago, we had Muhammad ibn Ali al-Shawkani, and he was based in Yemen, from the town Shawkan in Yemen. And he originally was from the Zaydi madhab. We talked about the Zaydi madhab and its rulings. However, he became so deep in his study, especially in the study of hadith, that he went beyond the borders of his madhab and no longer could be considered a Zaydi scholar. And he did a number of writings in fiqh, in hadith, etc. And he would mention the various opinions held by the scholars from the main schools, as well as the scholars from the Zaydi school in the area, from the area in which he lived. And he took the position, a very strong position, against taqleed. In fact, he ruled that taqleed was haram, and wrote a book called Al-Qawl al-Mufid fi Hukm al-Taqleed. Al-Qawl al-Mufid fi Hukm al-Taqleed. That is the beneficial ruling regarding the law on blind following. Right? And of course, naturally, he came under the attack of scholars of his time. In the area of India, what is now known as India and Pakistan, there was a leading scholar by the name of Ahmed ibn Abdul Rahim, though he came to be known as Shah Waliullah ad-Dihlawi. That became his title, Shah Waliullah ad-Dihlawi. And he was from that era, the early 18th century. And he, though born in an area where taqleed was most rampant, he, having studied all of the various sciences available to himself, called to the reopening of the door of ijtihad and the reunification of the schools of fiqh. So he was a reformer who emerged from that era. He revived the study of hadith, because basically the study had more or less died out. And though he didn't reject the schools of fiqh, he basically promoted the idea that people were free to choose any of them which he wished. And of course, that should be according to what he was convinced of, based on the evidences which were available. Now, in the early 19th century, another individual, really a thinker, could be called a scholar of it in his own right, Jamaluddin al-Afghani, he traveled extensively through the Muslim world calling for reform and the ending of taqleed, the reopening of the door of ijtihad. He was in India, in Mecca, in Constantinople, and he eventually settled in Egypt. And he got a position in Al-Azhar University, and he taught his ideas there. Though he wasn't able to make a major mark and a major change, he did affect his students, who then carried on his work. And the most notable of his students was Muhammad Abdu, who died in the beginning of the 20th century. And he continued to raise the banner of ijtihad. He was influenced by Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, in the sense of the importance of ijtihad and the freedom of scholars to choose according to the appropriate rulings, etc. However, he was also quite impressed, with the Western educational system and their developments in science, etc. And he became a leading promoter, and he became the head of Al-Azhar, leading promoter of what we call extreme modernism, which affected even his interpretations of the Qur'an. In spite of the fact that he initially was promoting, the idea of giving up taqleed and coming back to ijtihad, making Islam relevant to our times and applying it, etc., he went overboard due to the influence of Western sciences, which had more or less become the spokesman for knowledge. Muslim scientists were eclipsed, and what knowledge they had was absorbed into Western civilization's scientific developments. And so those who were awakening at that time, they became very much impressed with the Western developments and started to promote their ideas. So what we find in Ibn Taymiyyah's writings is that because of the influence of the West, which basically rejected revelation, then the idea of miracles, things going against nature, supernatural, this became something embarrassing. And you find that Muhammad Abdu in his writings spoke against them, reinterpreted many of the miracles even mentioned in the Qur'an itself. One of the well-known interpretations he gave to the Surah Al-Fil, which describe a flock of birds, Tayran Ababil, who dropped clay pebbles on the army of Abraha, which was attacking the Kaaba. So he claimed that really these birds, the term used, Tayran, Tayr, could be in Arabic, could refer in Arabic to a mosquito. So he felt that they were really mosquitoes carrying microbes. And it was these mosquitoes that bit the army of Abraha and the elephant, etc. Some disease or plague spread amongst them, and this is what brought them to a halt. This was his explanation. He also made the fatwa allowing Muslims to be involved in business transactions based on interest. He is the one who made that ruling as the Shaykh al-Azhar. Again, under the influence and the, you could say, impressionable effect of Western civilization now dominating Muslim lands. Egypt is under British rule. They have set up systems. Their financial institutions are now functioning, running. Banks are there in place, etc. What do? Rather than try to develop alternatives, he basically went along with the status quo and then found loopholes or interpretations which could then permit the people of that time to utilize the financial institutions available under British rule, British colonialism. So he accepted the transactions which were based on interest. He, of course, did base this ruling on some principle from Fiqh, because, of course, you had to have, a basis to make your claims, whether it was linguistic, as in the case of the tafsirs, the outlandish tafsirs which he developed. In the case of Fiqh, he developed it from general principles, and one among them was that dire necessity makes forbidden makes allowable the forbidden. What they call it dururat tubih al-mahdhurat. So he ruled that this was a necessity in our time. The British were ruling, banks were there, no other means to save your money, and etc., etc. You have to deal with interest, so it became permissible. Of course, this ruling was a weak ruling, and when the Sharia speaks about dire necessity, it talks about things which threaten one's life or one's limb. Either you're going to become sick, or you're going to lose a limb, an arm, a leg, or whatever, a lung. Any of these things which can harm you. In that circumstance, it's permissible for you to take from the haram what is enough to keep yourself alive and functioning. It should be noted that his main student, Muhammad Abdu's main student, Muhammad Rashid Rida, who died in 1935, who carried on the attack of Muhammad Abdu and Taqlid, he himself actually rejected the excesses of Muhammad Abdu. And he did a tafsir called Tafsir al-Manar, which is available, an excellent tafsir. And he quotes the statements of his mentor, Muhammad Abdu, while refuting them, etc. However, the other students of Muhammad Abdu, they embarked on a program of modernization. Among them, Qasim Amin, he was the first to attack polygamy and the simplicity of Islamic divorce, as well as the use of the veil. He is the one who promoted the burning of the veils in Egypt, which spread all over the Muslim world after that, and taking off of veils. And we are still living the legacy of that era. There were other scholars and movement leaders who emerged in that period, and I think we'll look at them in our next session, prior to looking at the position of the Imams, the great Imams, with regards to taqleed itself. And that's what we need to do, to see what position did they hold, to better understand what position should we take today. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions up to this point, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, we'll close the session. Any questions here? No? Are there any questions from the women's side? No? Therefore, we'll close our session. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem. Wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man istanna bi sunnati ila yawm ad-din. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In our previous session, we began to look at the sixth stage, which was the stage of stagnation and decline. We looked at the factors leading to the emergence of taqleed, and we then went on to look at some of the impact on fiqh of that period, with the compilation of fiqh, but according to the madhab, you could say madhab fanaticism, whereby the Majallat al-Ahkam al-Adila, which were produced by the Ottomans, was a codified version of Islamic law, but according to only the Hanafi school. Then we began to look at the fact that, and we said that some efforts were made also in more recent times in Saudi Arabia and also in Iran. But we then began to look at the reform movement which took place over this period. That though on one hand there was a decline, a stagnation, madhab fanaticism reaching its peak, where 4 different prayers were going on around the Kaaba. We also had, the prohibition of marriage between Hanafis and Shafi'is, etc. These very negative consequences, we can say, though they existed, they didn't represent the totality of what was happening with fiqh during that era. Because from the beginning of that era, after the fall of Baghdad, you had scholars like Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, who fought against the closing of the door of ijtihad. And he himself, though he studied under the Hanbali madhab scholars, he didn't limit himself to that particular school, and he produced another generation after himself, that he was like from the 14th century, late 13th, early 14th century, and he produced for the 14th, 15th century a generation of scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim, Imam al-Dhahabi, Ibn Kathir, in various fields of Islamic knowledge, producing very original works which were outside of the confines of the madhab. They were not, reduced and restricted to the confines of the madhab. But yet they were monumental works, like Ibn Kathir's tafsir. It was distinct and unique in that era, as it was a tafsir which was based, basically on hadith, an authentic hadith at that. Ibn Kathir, for example, also produced a massive work in history, right? And you had a Dhahabi. He produced a valuable set of works in hadith criticism, and Ibn al-Qayyim writing in basically all of the fields. Following them, you also had Muhammad al-Shawkani, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Shawkani from Yemen, born into a Zaydi family, studying Zaydi fiqh and studying hadith to the point where he left the confines of the madhab. And he studied, everything that was available, and he wrote in a variety of different fields, in tafsir, in fiqh, in hadith, etc. And he took the position very strongly that taqleed was haram, and he wrote a book, Al-Qawl al-Mufid fi Hukm al-Taqleed, in which he took the position that the blind following is out and out haram. Following his era, he is of course also from the 18th century. We had, along with him in that period, Ahmed ibn Abdul Rahim, better known as Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, who also opposed taqleed and was himself a major scholar, and he's to this day, considered amongst the greatest scholars that came out of India. And he reopened the door of ijtihad. He called for it anyway, and the reunification of the schools of fiqh, to get away from the divisions that existed. It doesn't mean that whatever he wrote was absolutely perfect. He also wrote some things on Sufism which were, as we would say, out to lunch, not really acceptable. He was affected, but in this area, in the area of fiqh, he definitely was, a giant. In the hadith also. In the 19th century, we had an individual, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, a very mysterious individual, somewhat enigmatic, who called for reform in the Muslim world, overthrowing the mantle of colonialism and colonization, splitting up of the Ummah, really calling for the Ummah to come back together. He traveled throughout India, throughout Arabia, throughout Turkey, finally settling in Egypt, where he taught at the University of Al-Azhar and influenced a number of people, a whole generation that came under him. There are information which was gathered to indicate that he was a Freemason, but in that period of time, basically everybody was involved in Freemasonry. They didn't really understand its implications, its roots, and all these kinds of things. So it was not uncommon to find leading thinkers of that period, caught up in Freemasonry. At any rate, of his leading, we could say, some of his ideas were somewhat extreme. He basically elevated the human mind and its logical deductions to be equivalent to that of divine revelation, which is like back to the Mu'tazilites, the ideas of the Mu'tazilites, where what the human mind deduces to be good is good. And, because of these, some extreme ideas he had and his involvement in the Masonic movement, many later scholars consider him to be very suspect, that he was maybe somebody planted by the British, whatever. It may be a bit extreme, but his program was not really, we could say, Qur'an and Sunnah. He had gotten caught up in other things. And one of his leading students, Muhammad Abdu, we talked about him, he became Sheikh al-Azhar, and he also studied Ibn Taymiyyah's works and was among those who called for the revival of ijtihad and the displacement of taqleed. He also, coming up in a time where colonialism, was at its peak. The colonial powers were now highly developed in the earlier stage when colonialism attacked the Muslim world. The difference in industrialization, this kind of thing, was not that great. Muslims were weak, they were stronger, it was just gunpowder, their guns were bigger or whatever, and they managed to knock out the Muslim ships and took over the Muslim areas. Whereas after hundreds of years had passed, the wealth that they had taken out of the Muslim world and the rest of the world, they used it to build, and fuel an industrial revolution in Europe, right? Which then put the Western powers now a whole step in advance of the rest of the world. Now you're talking about the first world and the third world. So in the period of the 19th century, the West were producing motor cars and all these other kind of things. This was just technology way beyond anything the Muslim world was capable of doing, right? So Muslims then felt, very much inferior, and there was this tendency to look at the Western society and the greatness of what they've done and respect it and to hold it up very highly. And as a result of that, then a number of the scholars of this era became affected by modernist thinking, feeling that, Islam needs to be sort of revived a bit, been modernized to meet with the challenge of the Muslim world, of the Western world, Western society. Muhammad Abduh was one of those who did come under those influences. So, things which were spiritual and mysterious and supernatural, these were looked at as being backward things, because basically with the West through the 18th century, 19th century, basically from the 15th century onwards, where you had what they call the Renaissance, from that period onward, the shift away from religious things and, science is developing rapidly, explaining things that couldn't be explained before. Then basically everything spiritual and supernatural became just stories, legends, unbelievable. They're not really acceptable. So Muslims in that later period, under that influence, where Western legends were made fun of by modern science, explaining away things that the West had tried to explain with stories and things like this from the Bible, so as not to expose the Qur'an to ridicule. The people like Muhammad Abduh sought to give new interpretations to the verses that would be acceptable to the Western mind. So when he had to deal with the idea of, in Surah Al-Fil, where it describes, the Abraha who came from Yemen with his army, with the elephant, trying to destroy the Kaaba, and the flock of birds that flew over, a miracle from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, dropping pebbles on them from on high, causing people to be killed, killing the elephant, etc. This was just something supernatural. The West would never accept that. What would make a bunch of birds go and pick up pebbles and drop it on people, en masse? This is something unthinkable, right? You can't train birds to do this even, right? So it would be something rejected. So Muhammad Abduh then went back to the language, and said in the verse where it says, Tayran Ababil. Tayran, Tayr is something which flies. So it didn't necessarily mean only a bird. It could be a grasshopper, it could be a dragonfly, and it could also be a mosquito. And what are the pebbles? The pebbles are actually microbes. Mosquitoes have microbes, when microbes carrying illnesses, right? Diseases and things like this. So when they bite you, the disease goes in and you get sick. So that's really what happened, right? And this is just a colorful way in which the Quran described it, right? And so on and so forth. He went through the Quran, and people after him, Haikal, there's a guy by the name of Haikal, who wrote a history of the Prophet Muhammad, Muhammad Haikal, and you'll find in his history of the Prophet's life, he explains away all of the miracles. He is from that same era, and his seerah of the Prophet was quite popular up until quite recently. Anyway, what he did also, Muhammad Abduh, the leading figure of that time, he also made interest dealings permissible. And people of that era, early 1920s and that, people like Muhammad Yusuf Ali, who wrote his tafsir or translation of the Quran into English, one of the most popular ones. In his footnotes, he uses the same arguments of Muhammad Abduh in defense of modern interest, saying that, this is different from the interest which was prohibited in the Quran. The one prohibited in the Quran is this extreme form, whereas the what's going on in the modern banking system. This is really just a business, right? Anyway, the point is that he was, on one hand, one of these leading callers to, reviving the door of ijtihad, but in his ijtihad, he went off, right? Due to the impact of modernist thought on him, right, from Jamaluddin Afghani. And his students became the leaders of the modernist movement. People like Qasim Amin is the one who led to the burning of the veil. They had the first march down the streets of Cairo where women took off their veils and threw it in the streets and set them on fire, right? But of course, veil that time meant niqab. It means they didn't take off headscarves. They were taking off the niqab. Later on, they did go and take off headscarves, and then it became a standard in Egypt where women didn't wear headscarves. Actually, even one of the recent scholars by the name of Muhammad, I forgot his last name. Anyway, he did a book called The Return of the Veil, because really it's in the last 20 years, 25 years that the veil they're wearing, even though the hijab itself had returned to Egypt, right? Prior to that, back in the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, nobody wore it. They took it off altogether. Only in the countryside, and women of the countryside, they would be wearing khimar, and some of them would be wearing veils. But in the main cities, big cities like Cairo, it was gone. Alexander finished. It's non-existent. But he had also at the same time some students like Muhammad Rashid Rida, who completed the tafsir that he had been working on, known as Al-Manar. And he, in the work on the tafsir of Muhammad Abdu, he corrected Muhammad Abdu's deviations. And he mentioned them. He mentioned what he said and so on and so on, and then he rejected it, and was a positive call for a revival of Islam in that era. See, what also came out of this period is, on the other hand, a series of movements, because the fiqh, on one hand, was breaking the confines of the taqlid, the blind taqlid, but at the same time, from the side of Muhammad Abdu and those, they were affected by the colonial they were affected by the impact of modernization and technology in the colonial powers and what had been brought to the Muslim world. They were so infected that they basically had surrendered to it. Well, there was also movements which opposed it. And these movements, popular movements of the 20th century, involved a variety of different forms. It took a variety of different forms. Among them, the movement known as the Ikhwan, which was founded by Hassan al-Banna. I mentioned in the book here other scholars of the 20th century, but really Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi were not really scholars in the traditional sense. I mean, they were self-taught. Hassan al-Banna's father was a scholar from Al-Azhar, but he himself was a school teacher. But he had a good background, and he founded the Ikhwan Muslimun movement in Egypt. And among the big figures was Sayyid Qutb, who was himself a writer, a very powerful journalist, who wrote in a very, very, very powerful pen. And his tafsir, known as Fi Dhilal al-Qur'an, had a massive impact in the society, and it remains banned in Egypt until today, from that era when Sayyid Qutb was himself actually hung for refusing to give up the call to the revival of the Sharia and re-implementation of Sharia. Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi in Pakistan, similar thing. He's a self-taught scholar, and he also called for the establishment or re-establishment of Islamic rule in the Muslim world. And these movements, and he himself was also faced the gallows, actually for his attack against the Qadianis in his time. They were quite powerful and influential, and they almost had him executed. And in the midst of all of this, there were also movements, or we should mention also the movement known as, Jamaat al-Tabligh, which was founded by the Maulana Muhammad Ilyas in India. And that movement, rather than focusing on changing the state, it focused on the masses of people, trying to bring them back to the mosques, because the mosques had become abandoned. People were not going there anymore, so his movement focused on that element. Of course, what happened is that these movements, though their intent might have been very good, the knowledge base in terms of the movement and the fiqh that we spoke about earlier was weak, and so the movements took on different sort of factionless characters. There was at the same time, I should mention, a movement for going back to the hadith as the main focus. You could say the Ahl Hadith movement, which developed in India and Pakistan, and also in Egypt, where there it was called Ansar al-Sunnah, so they came to be known as. And the leading scholars of that movement, we don't really hear their names. We could say the political type movements, everybody sort of knows them. But people like Sheikh Hamid al-Fiqhi, and in India, the Sheikh Thanaullah al-Amristari. These are people who are names which are really not known. But Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani tends to be more known. He was among the product of that era, who called to a revival of the hadith sciences, going back to the Sunnah, the pure Qur'an and the Sunnah. And we had others like Sheikh Ibn Baz in Saudi Arabia, also making the call. And I should say, really, in Saudi Arabia, the call towards Quran and Sunnah free from the madhab fanaticism didn't have as much of a struggle as it had in other parts, because the movement itself, in the first place, the so-called Wahhabi movement of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, did not support factionalism, or what we could call Hizbiyah, right from the beginning. But the other groups, because they didn't have this support from the early, the examples of the early generation and the guidance from there, then they developed into their own factionless type movements. So from the Ikhwan, you had certain groups appearing, like the Takfir al-Hijra, Jama'atul Jihad, and Jama'ah Islamiyah, who unleashed violence in the society, and more modern versions like the Qaeda, etc., where they've, taken unorthodox interpretations and used it to defend the killing of Muslims, attacking of Muslims. And as the Islamic awakening increased, then of course the various regimes in the Muslim lands tried to suppress it. So you found a number of military struggles, you could say political military struggles, which developed in places like Algeria and Syria, in North Africa, other places in North Africa. As the concept of bringing back the Sharia, grew amongst them. But what they ended up forming, was something similar to the factionalism which developed amongst the various schools of Islamic law, in that these different movements became like the different schools, and people ended up calling to these movements. And if you were not a part of the movement, then you were looked at as being some kind of an enemy, or misguided or whatever. And we still, in our times, experience the remnants of it. We can hear it coming from people who are in the Jamaat Tabligh, how they perceive da'wah and how da'wah should be made, and how they perceive those who have not taken bay'ah to their leader. Similarly, the Ikhwan, you hear similar kinds of rumblings and statements which imply this, you're either with us or you're against us kind of mentality. So, the effects of this movement didn't really contribute to overcoming the madhab factionalism. It provided, in fact, just another trend of factionalism amongst the ummah, splitting up people even more. But what did come out of this era is that comparative fiqh, the idea of comparing the different schools, became a standard, in most of the schools of higher learning across the various parts of the Muslim world. So comparative fiqh, took on a place which allowed the study of the various schools. But what would happen is that even though comparative fiqh was available, students would study it, the official fiqh taught in the school would be of the madhab of that area. And Azhar, being the oldest and most well-known university, what it did, because it brought in students from all over the world, the other universities which are, for example, in Jordan or in Morocco or Libya or whatever, the people there who are studying there are already just the people of that region. So going with one madhab was not a problem. But Al-Azhar, because it was so renowned, people were coming from all over the Muslim world to study there. So what they developed, was a system whereby when you signed up for the school, they ask you, what is your madhab? So once you put that you're a Maliki, for example, then they put you in the class of the Malikis. So all your teachers are Malikis from the time you go in until the time you graduate. So though they taught all four schools, and in fact they even include the Ja'fari school of the Shiites, it's taught there, teachers who would teach the different schools were from the same madhab, so they just really reinforced the madhab fanaticism and divisions, factionalism that was reinforced there. Let's say the fanaticism may have been brought down somewhat, because here all of the schools are being taught, but the factionalism, meaning, you have your madhab, I have mine, let's look for the truth and find what the truth is, but, whatever it's in my madhab, this is the truth. It's truth for me. Truth may be relevant. What you see as the truth may be different from what I see. Yours can be a truth, mine can be a truth. That kind of an attitude was reinforced. So it's really only in a few schools, really, in the Muslim world, like the Islamic University of Medina, where, you found the fiqh, etc., being taught without relying specifically on a madhab. Actually, in Medina, when you study in the high school, they have a high school there, a junior high and a high school. In the junior high and the high school, they do teach fiqh according to the Hanbali madhab. But once you reach the college, then they teach it according to all of the madahib. Okay? So, this brings us to, our own time. Now, you can say that the call to going back to the Qur'an and Sunnah and to avoid the factionalism that is current, very deeply rooted in the past, is increasing. More and more students are taking this position, setting up new institutions which are not caught up in the madhab factionalism. So this is going down now. And as I said, comparative fiqh, is on the books in most of the schools. Now, having looked at all of that, it's important for us to look now at the position of the imams themselves with regards to taqleed. Because the point is that the position of the imams was basically hidden from the masses of the people. People didn't understand that the Imams didn't call for this that the people were following. They were far away from it. But for the masses of the people, when you said this, the Hanafi school, it meant that this is what Abu Hanifa taught, this is what he understood, and going against his school was considered some form of deviation. If you were a Hanafi and you didn't agree with the rulings in it, you took rulings from another school, this is like, something of a deviation. However, what we do find when we go back to the scholars themselves, and we start, for example, with Imam Abu Hanifa, we just look at the main four. What was their position? Nu'man ibn Thabit. He systematically discouraged taqleed. How did he do it? First and foremost, he forbade his students from writing down his opinions. That's a major start. He didn't allow his students to write down his opinions. And he said very clearly to them, don't write down all that you hear from me, for I may hold a position today and leave it tomorrow, hold another tomorrow and leave it the day after. It's authentic narration related back from Imam Abu Hanifa. So knowing that opinions vary, they're product of human reasoning, he didn't want them etched in stone so that people would then fall back on them and not use their own intellect and to try to understand themselves. So what you find then is that he would disallow the writing of his opinions with one exception. The exception being that if that particular opinion was thoroughly debated and it was agreed upon by all of the students, then they would write it down. So this fundamental position or attitude which was taken by Abu Hanifa helped to keep down blind following from his generation and the generation which came after him. He also made very strong statements regarding the blind following of his opinions and those of his students, like the statement attributed to him, it is forbidden for any one of you who does not know my proofs to make a ruling according to my statements. Meaning that whatever ruling he made, for one to just take it without understanding how he arrived at it, he said it's forbidden, not allowed. Because if we don't, this is what blind following is. You don't need to know how the scholar got there. You don't need to know the proofs. You don't need to have any of that at all. Just the scholar said it, that's enough. So he took the position that this is a forbidden position. You cannot say this. And this especially amongst those who are seeking knowledge, tulabul ilm. Of course, amongst the common masses, if they have no other option, then that's a different situation. He also gave precedence to the Qur'an and the Sunnah over his own rulings. As he said, if I've made a ruling which contradicts Allah's book or the Messenger's hadith, then reject my ruling. So he stressed to them that my ruling is nothing. If it goes against the Qur'an and Sunnah, it has no value. So, in this way, he opposed taqleed. Because he put his own positions, his rulings, in their proper context. And he identified in a very strong statement the foundation of his madhab. As he said, if the hadith is sahih, authentic, then it is my madhab. إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. He took that position. And that really is the end of blind following. But because this information is not available to the masses of the people, it's only the scholars who have access to the books, etc., have access to these opinions, these statements. So it doesn't reach the masses of the people. So the masses just follow blindly. And so you find the Hanafis, in fact, were some of the most fanatical. I remember way back in the late 70s, there was an individual, Hussein Ishik from Turkey, who had produced a number of books, and he distributed thousands of copies, English material, reading material. And, he clearly states in there, when he's talking about fiqh and so on, so people have to follow a madhab. And if you don't follow madhab, then your imam is shaitan. And he mentioned in there that one of the questions you will be asked in the grave after being asked, who was your prophet? Who was your Lord? What was your religion? You will be asked, what is your madhab? What was your madhab? I mean, this is a fabricated statement. He brings it in a book, promoting Islam, right? We could call it promoting Islam. Anyway, the point is that you have some of the most fanatical followers, blind followers, are the Hanafis. So it is shocking when you consider these statements of people like Abu Hanifa. We also have from Imam Malik similar statements. But even more fundamentally, we could see in Imam Malik's dealing with issues a complete willingness to change his opinion, as Abu Hanifa was prepared to do it, and that's why I told him don't write anything down. Imam Malik, though, he didn't tell people not to write anything down because he taught hadith. That was his methodology. He had made a compilation, al-Muwatta, and he taught it. So to tell people don't write it down, that wouldn't be appropriate. So they used to write down. But whenever evidence came to him to the contrary, because he was using the hadith that he was narrating, to explain the deen. So when he came to the issue of washing the feet in wudu, he was asked about washing between the toes, and he replied that it wasn't necessary. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't, don't. It's not necessary. But then one of the students there in his circle told him that he had a narration, and he quoted where it came from. It came from Al-Layth ibn Sa'd and others, that the Prophet ﷺ used to wash between his toes with his little finger. Didn't say little finger of the left hand or the right hand. So some people say, no, you should use your left hand for your left foot, your right hand for your right foot. We don't have any evidence of that, just that he used to use his little finger. So using the little finger to rub between the toes, clean between the toes, this is from the Sunnah. So Imam Malik, after that, then he would narrate this particular narration from the Prophet ﷺ. So he didn't have a problem with it. And that's what he would answer when he was asked about it. And following that point, he would say that yes, it should be done. We also find him making statements concerning opinions. He said, verily I'm a man, I err, and I'm at times correct. So thoroughly investigate my opinions and take whatever agrees with the book and the Sunnah and reject whatever contradicts them. That was his position. Very straight, very clear. He discouraged people from following blindly any of the earlier rulings, or sticking with rulings when it's become clear that they go against the Qur'an and the Sunnah. And we all know the story about Al-Muwatta, where it was commissioned by Harun al-Rashid and Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, and after he had compiled it, this was his book, his major compilation, they wanted to make it the constitution of the Muslim state, and he refused to allow them to do it. He didn't give them permission because he felt that there were many hadiths which he hadn't come across, and that's true. Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal makes a compilation of over 40,000 hadiths. Later, Imam Malik in his Muwatta, has maybe about 1,000. So, mean, that just gives you an idea of what was out there and what he was able to correct. But he was aware that he didn't have everything. So that's why he opposed the putting down of the he opposed the putting down of his book Al-Muwatta to be the constitution for the land, where only the selection of hadith that he made from the hadith which he had heard then became the law for everybody. Right? He was much greater an individual than to succumb to that temptation. Imam Shafi'i carried on the same tradition of his teacher, Imam Malik, reminding people that they were human beings that forgot things. No matter how good they were with hadith in terms of its memorization and narration, they were still human beings, and they did forget. So he said in an authentically recorded statement, "There is none among us who has not had a sunnah of Allah's messenger elude him or have one slip his mind. So no matter what rulings I have made or fundamental principles I have opposed or fundamental principles I have proposed, there will be in them things contrary to the rulings of Allah's messenger." He's saying this is guaranteed. Without a doubt, I'm going to say some things which are incorrect. So what do you do then? So he said, therefore, the correct ruling is according to what Allah's messenger said, and that is really my ruling. This is the position that he took. However, later generation, got stuck in this. And this is why, for example, you find a position which Imam Shafi'i took with regards to praying qunut in Fajr. There is a hadith there is a hadith which mentions that the Prophet ﷺ on one occasion began to do the qunut in Fajr, Salatul Fajr, and that he continued to do it till he died. But this hadith turned out to be weak, and there was ample evidence to show that he didn't. That in fact he only did it on some occasions, and he didn't do it continually. So the correct position is that you don't do it. You can do it sometimes, but that you don't do it every Fajr. But Shafi'is, religiously do it every Fajr. So this is among the rulings which evidence has come to show the contrary, but the followers of the madhab won't let it go. Another statement of his concerning personal opinions: the Muslims of my time were of a unanimous opinion that one who comes across an authentic sunnah of Allah's messenger is not allowed to disregard it in favor of someone else's opinions. If you find an authentic hadith, no doubt about its authenticity, then to put over it the opinions of man is not permissible. Lastly, Imam Abu Shafi'i, he repeated what Abu Hanifa was known to have said. إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. If the hadith is authentic, then it is really my madhab. He said exactly the same thing. So what you find is that students who came after him also, for that first generation, were firm in their position against the madhabs. But the later generations that came, then it crept in as it did with everybody else. The fourth of the great imams, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was himself a student of Imam Shafi'i, he did a massive hadith collection, as I mentioned, of some 40,000 hadiths. But at the same time, he studied his fiqh and the other various Islamic disciplines. So he warned openly against taqlid. He had straight statements against it. Why? Because in his era, it was starting to develop. He was a generation after the time of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, and he was a student of Imam Shafi'i. So you hear him saying the opinions of Al-Awza'i. Al-Awza'i was the Imam of Beirut. Malik and Abu Hanifa are simply opinions, and to me they're all equal. But the real criterion for right or wrong is in the hadiths. The real criterion for right or wrong is in the hadiths. That's a very strong statement, and he's mentioning the leading scholars by name: Al-Awza'i, Malik, and Abu Hanifa. And we know already that Imam Ahmad's preference for hadith was so strong that he used to allow weak hadiths as evidences used in his major compilation of hadiths. And he also made the strong negative statement: whoever rejects an authentic hadith of Allah's Messenger is on the verge of destruction. He's on the verge of destruction. So the idea of rejecting a hadith is totally unacceptable. It goes against the whole principles of the holding on firmly to the Qur'an and the Sunnah, which demands that, of course, we hold on firmly to the understanding which was given to us from the scholars of hadith. So this represents that first generation, and you can find similar statements from Al-Awza'i, from Al-Layth and others. They all shared the same spirit, and they could see the tendency. Why is it Abu Hanifa is making these kind of statements? Because the tendency to taqleed, to following, is great. In fact, it's so great that people will do it unless you fight it. So they took it upon themselves to fight it to the degree that they could. And you hear the statements getting stronger as time is passing. So when you hear the statements of Imam Ahmed, it's almost as if he's telling people to reject all of the statements of Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa. But he's not. He's just saying that they're opinions. They're rulings, but they're opinions, based on opinions. And in fact, on the basis of that, they're all equal. So whoever has the best evidences along with him, then his will become the more correct. That's the bottom line. But as he said, the real criterion for right and wrong is in the hadiths. That's how we know ultimately what is right and what is wrong. Now, the students of the Imams carried on the same tradition. The great students we find saying and doing the opposite of what the madhab, or the way of fiqh, those who follow it on a large scale, do. So you'll find some of them from the Hanafi school, for example, raising their hands, right, in prayer, whereas the rest of the madhab doesn't. And they rule against it, and they argue against it, and they bring weak and fabricated hadith against it, right, to prove that, no, we must follow our madhab. But when you read the writings of these earlier scholars, you find them quite in tune with the position held by their forefathers among the scholars, founding scholars of the various schools of Islamic law. And they generally held that the shahada is violated by taqleed. That when a person follows another religiously in the deen, we're not talking about, learning skills from a carpenter or a welder or whatever. Sure, you can blindly follow them to learn. But the point is that when you're dealing with a religion, one has to be very careful that you don't end up making innovation by giving rulings from yourself or rulings from the madhab, which have not gone through a comparative study, where you've now tried to find what is most authentic. So for the average person, what he's faced with is shuyukh, scholars who have circles, teaching from different schools. What does he do? Well, he goes to the different circles, many as he can, hear from them, and the one that he feels most comfortable with, he feels he's learning the most with, then he sits under those scholars and learns. But at the same time, he should ask the scholars, get clarification, whether they are among those who fanatically promoted the idea of madhab, or whether they were among those who felt that it was unnatural and that we should just be following, again, the madhab of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is basically what the call is. So, inshallah, in the next session, we'll look at a few of the major statements of the scholars who were from the generation after that of Abu Hanifa, Malik, and the others, right? That these are their students, and what you find is that they have maintained the same spirit. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ had said, the best of generations is my generation, then those who come after them, then those who come after them. So the last of those three groups was the era of the great Imams. So those who are closest to it tend to be most flexible, tend to be more reasonable, praying with each other, some raising their hands, some not, and these kind of things. Whereas those that came after them, then we had the period of stagnation and decline setting in. So inshallah, the next period, as I said, we'll look over the rulings held by the students, and then we go on to look at differences amongst the ummah and how they should be looked at. Okay, inshallah, we have a few minutes remaining. Do you have any questions anybody wants to ask concerning what we've covered so far? Positions of the great Imams with regards to taqleed, and the summary that I made of the previous look at the evolution of fiqh. Does anybody want to raise any issues concerning what we have mentioned? No? Then we'll close. Really comment question, whether the fact that in Saudi there isn't a stress on the madhab, whether that is a factor in their overall practice of the deen being closer to the Qur'an and Sunnah than in other countries. I would say that the main reason is because of the movement itself, the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. It had an impact on the society, and he taught away from taqleed. Though he was from the Hanbali school, and the Hanbali school, because it was the school that he belonged to, became the official school of Saudi Arabia. So their legal system is based mainly on the school, and all that is taught in the government schools, for example, is all from that school. So that's the norm, right? So the element of taqleed is there to a certain degree, but because of the fact that the leading scholars of the movement and the time afterwards, they were themselves under the influence of Ibn Taymiyyah. They had been opened up to Ibn Taymiyyah and his students, and that gave them that greater consciousness and led them to oppose the blind following and not themselves to restrict their ijtihad to their madhab. These are, I think, were the major factors. If there are no other questions, we'll close. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.